Bitcoin Matters.
In this episode, we'll analyze and discuss how Bitcoin may shape foreign policy in the 21st century. So, Akin, in general, what ways would you say that Bitcoin will shape foreign policy in the 21st century?
What it will do at a minimum is take certain foreign policy tools off of the table. It will definitely affect things like financial sanctions. If all the countries that are suffering financial sanctions right now settled on Bitcoin as the payment rails instead of SWIFT, then it won't be possible for any government to make a phone call to SWIFT, which is a private company, and tell them you can't reconcile the banks in these countries anymore. So if all these countries settle on Bitcoin, then that tool is not available and everybody can trade in any way they like without permission. So in a world where financial sanctions are used to punish rogue states, this is a very important first step in removing that tool. Now, obviously, Bitcoin is more important as a general tool for people to improve their lives and increase efficiency. But it will have some limited side effects, like changing the ways financial sanctions operate. What needs to happen is these countries like Iran and Russia, they need to understand that Bitcoin is not a threat to their economies and to unilaterally settle on Bitcoin as a means of reconciling inside their systems. Once they do that, then nobody will be able to come in and call Bitcoin to tell Bitcoin that Russians can't reconcile their accounts with Bitcoin, because in Bitcoin, there is nobody to call. There is no office. There is no CEO. There's no place where you can put pressure. It's very interesting that they haven't woken up to this fact. We know that Russians part of the BRICS system. So they understand that it's important for people to have a group that they're all part of to help them do trade and negotiations and things like that. But they don't seem to have understood that Bitcoin can be a very key part of having a system that's just for them, that can't be used as a weapon against them. And we know that financial sanctions are in fact a weapon. They're a weapon as much as a tool of foreign policy.
Yeah, I totally agree that, financial sanctions can be used as a weapon. And in fact, I think that the currencies themselves can also be weaponized. Don't you think? Or do you think that you'd want to explain a little bit more how the dollar itself is used kind of more as an offensive weapon?
The dollar, because it's being printed at will, can be used to give one state more power than another state. So if you have the power to create money, you can use that to do all sorts of things on financial markets, and also to build weapons and many other things, skew the power towards you. With Bitcoin, you can't do that. With Bitcoin, everybody's on the same level. It's a level playing field, and it removes the ability of the state to distort the economy. So this is going to be a very important effect on the world economy. Governments are not going to be able to spend money willy-nilly or in a crony capitalist manner without having to tax for it. Every single Bitcoin has to be accounted for because they can't be generated out of thin air. And so this is going to be a very interesting problem for people in the Keynesian mindset. How are they going to adapt to the removal of the ability to print money at will? And of course, if nobody's accepting the fiat money anymore, both internationally and on a local level, this is going to have an effect on the value of that money. And this is once again part of the hyper-Bitcoinization, where all the fiats are destroyed. That's what it actually means. People will stop using these fiat currencies, their value will go down, and printing it won't be sufficient to stop it from happening. It's going to make for a very, very interesting scenario, that's for sure.
Yeah. I read recently in What Has Government Done to Our Money by Murray Rothbard. He had a quote that I really loved. He said, "Fortunately, inflation cannot go on forever, for eventually people wake up to this form of taxation. They wake up to the continual shrinkage in the purchasing power of their dollar." And I think that's what Bitcoin, one of the brilliant things about it is that it's kind of exposed that Keynesian model that we operate under, and that our governments, it's not just one, but operate in this mindset of continual expansion and inflation.
Exactly right. I think some of them also genuinely believe that that's the way the economy needs to run. That the money supply must increase in order to meet the demand for more goods. Now, in the past, the arguments you can make against that were purely academic and theoretical. Now, with Bitcoin, this experiment can be run in real time. We can now have two competing forms of money and see which is the best one. The difference between the people who are using Bitcoin is that we're willing to allow this experiment to play out in the market, whereas the other people are not willing to allow the market to determine which is the best money. They insist on using force to make their case true. And this is what I think most ethical people will find unacceptable. If that Keynesian money really is the best money, let the market decide it's the best money. I think that underneath they understand that it actually isn't the best money. And they also know the side effects that are going to be brought about by Bitcoin, and they don't want those either. I think that's the key to their irrational hostility towards Bitcoin. They actually know what it's going to do, and they don't like the sound of it.
Right. It's going to bring a reckoning because the sort of expansionist way of life under a Bitcoin model really, it kind of, you have to rein it in a little bit with Bitcoin. We live under a credit sort of society, and we've been used to that sort of living, at the expense of others, where we defer the penalties further on down the line to further generations because of inflation and what have you. But with Bitcoin, you can't just cheat like that anymore. You have to be accountable.
That's right. And it's not something that it's not being imposed. It's a side effect of having sound money. And so when we talk about the difference between the fiat system and the Bitcoin system, there's no force involved when you're using Bitcoin. It's only the fiat people that have to use force to make their money, that their system work. And it's very interesting that people are willing to accept that the fiat system is designed to lose money, or to lose value, by a minimum of 2% every year. They think this is normal. But when they talk about Bitcoin, which actually doesn't lose value year on year, they don't accept this. So I think with a lot of these things, the imagination of the people who are talking about them is not sufficiently strong to realize what's going to happen, to have a picture, even a blurry picture of what's going to happen in the future. It has to be literally shown to them working. Otherwise, they can't accept it. And in the business space, you find this with the first mover. The first person to do something is always treated with skepticism. But once they're successful, then everybody understands that it is actually possible and it's been normalized. And so they think, oh, yes, that's just the way things are. And this is going to happen with Bitcoin as well, I'm sure.
So let's discuss, we'll get into some specifics here, how foreign policy in the United States and the United Kingdom might be shaped in response to Bitcoin.
What they'll do is they'll essentially have the tool of financial sanctions removed from them, and they're going to have to replace those with something else. They can still control the way goods move on the open seas, for example. They can still control corporations that are working in their jurisdictions. So they can control physical goods, but what they won't be able to do is control money. And if these countries, which are facing the sanctions regimes, can find enough allies in other places in the world to supply them goods, they'll get those goods from those other people. So Bitcoin removes only one tool from their toolkit. And I have to say that I would be very surprised if any of these countries switches from SWIFT to Bitcoin as their backend, because we've seen over the past couple of years that they're not sufficiently imaginative enough to think about the way things can be without the global system having control of them. It's almost like they want to be part of the global system, because if they're the underdogs, they can more easily control their populations. This is the only explanation I can think of, because it's so obvious to me that with this tool in their hands, they can actually be independent nations instead of being vassal nations. But if they have an enemy, it's very useful for them to keep total totalitarian control over their populations. In the case of Iran, their money is not an Islamic money. It literally looks like funny money with the pictures of the leaders on the face, just like the Westerners do. So they're imitating the Western forms of money, not only in the money supply aspect, the Keynesianism aspect, but in the physical form as well. So these guys have a problem in wanting to be accepted by foreign countries at the same time with a deep desire to be independent, to do things their own way. Well, doing things your own way means actually doing it your own way and not imitating the West in a sort of cargo cult. So they've got a big problem, these countries, and I cannot see how they're going to solve it without embracing Bitcoin and cutting themselves off from these bad ideas, which are all imported ideas.
So what are your thoughts on these countries that maybe don't have interests that are aligned with, say, United States or United Kingdom? I mean, do you think that their goal is just going to become to amass as much Bitcoin as possible and hope to establish an alternate sort of currency system that that can't be censored by the Western powers? Or how do you foresee that playing out?
First of all, I think it's important to say that the governments of these countries are not the same as the people in these countries. They're two separate things. So what these governments want and what the people there want shouldn't be conflated. Now, how these people would adapt to Bitcoin is an interesting question. I don't think they have the technical competence to be able to pull it off. And certainly they're not economically literate enough to pull it off. If that weren't the case, they wouldn't, their currencies wouldn't be inflating. They would be very, very strict about how much money they print. So it's not likely that they're going to be able to take advantage of these new tools and the correct ideas to give themselves the independence that people like you and me would assume that they want. It's not smart to assume that people have the same goals and the same ideas as we do. These people are very different. They're from very, very different cultures from us, and their goals and ideology is literally alien to us. So when we talk about the sensibility of moving to Bitcoin so that they can be independent nations, to them, this might not be their goal. So we need to understand what their actual goals are. And often it's hard to discern what that is because what they're doing doesn't seem to be rational. It doesn't make sense. And that on top of the difference between the state and the people who live there only serves to confuse the whole picture because we know that there are people in these countries that are interested in using Bitcoin, interested in interacting with the quote unquote outside world. And so it's a bit of a confusing picture.
So this week's question of the week is from Douglas Coobs, Twitter user at Douglas Coobs. He writes, for your podcast question and answer, can you explain why Bitcoin's proof of work can't or shouldn't solve additional problems like folding proteins instead of just finding a nonce?
Well, thank you for this question, Mr. Coobs. The real question here is why are you asking if the proof of work can be repurposed for something else? Proof of work is the fundamental breakthrough that made Bitcoin possible. And Bitcoin's purpose is to replace fiat. So it does a very important job that will change the entire world. So if it only ever does that, that's more than enough. If you want to solve the protein folding problem, you can use a tool like Folding at Home. You go to their website, download their client, start running it as a background process on your machine, and you can fold proteins day and night. So there's already a way to solve protein folding. Instead of asking what proof of work can be repurposed for, you should be asking, why do you want to do that? Why is it Bitcoin as it is not enough for you? And I think once you ask that fundamental question, these questions like how proof of work can be repurposed will really not ever bubble through into your consciousness.
Right. And I had read recently in, I think, a Twitter thread, someone, or it could have been a Medium article, but someone was talking about, they asked the exact same question, and the writer said something to the effect that, well, you know, if you repurpose part of the hash power toward other problems or using it to solve other equations, you are compromising the security of the network. So that was my thought, was basically Bitcoin's network mining was created for one purpose, and that's to mine. And Bitcoin as money, of course, using it with having it as a monetary value, we're incentivized to have mining exist for the sole purpose of securing the blockchain and keeping it as money. That's what it's for.
That's exactly right. And also, when people talk like this, they're not actually running a huge warehouse with big electricity bills with hundreds and hundreds of machines mining Bitcoin. If it was them running those rigs mining Bitcoin, they wouldn't for a second think about repurposing it to fold proteins, because there's no money in folding proteins. They run those rigs to make money. So there's no such thing as a Bitcoin mining rig that can be suddenly repurposed because some guy on the internet wants it to be repurposed. No, if you want to fold proteins, you have to go and buy the computers to go and do that. If you buy computers to go and mine Bitcoin, you want Bitcoin. You don't want to find folded proteins. And of course, the amount of money it takes in electricity to fold these proteins would be absolutely enormous. Who's going to pay you to do that? You see, all these economic factors, all these realities of who owns what, who's actually going to be doing the work, need to be discussed while you're discussing these things. And then it make much more sense. Nobody's going to do that because there's no money in folding proteins.
If you'd like us to answer your question on the next episode of Bitcoin Matters, please send us a message by visiting bitcoinmatterspodcast.com. The selected winner will receive an Azteco Bitcoin voucher. Thank you for tuning in to Bitcoin Matters. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a thumbs up on YouTube or a review in the iTunes Store. To learn more about Bitcoin Matters, please visit us at bitcoinmatterspodcast.com.